to speak at this conference at all. I was only going to say a few words during the speech of my colleague Alexandra. But when I learned that the conference is going to be called Fighting the Fog and Finding Clarity and Lucidity and so on, so that was its announced topic, I thought that we couldn't do without the legacy and the works of Mikhail Leonovich Gasparov. Mikhail Leonovich Gasparov was a Renaissance figure in the field of Russian humanities of the second half of the 20th century. And his immense and versatile legacy is still underappreciated, not just in the West, but in Russia as well. He graduated from the classics department of Moscow State University, and he spent much of his career in the classics department of the Institute of World Literature of the Russian Academy of Sciences, contributing to the history of ancient literature, writing works and articles on the poetry of Horace, Virgil, Ovid, and so on, and also translating a lot. So this is a picture of the so-called Library of Ancient Literature, which is not all Gasparov's translations, of course, but a lot of that were. And so that was basically the classics, Greeks and Romans, were the bulk of his translation output, but not just that. In the 1960s and 70s, as a student, Gasparov became interested in the esoteric tradition of studying poetry through statistical and mathematical methods. And that was the tradition that was actually launched and developed by the poet and mystic Andrei Bely. And it experienced a kind of rebirth in the 1960s and 70s, thanks in part due to the efforts of the great mathematician Andrei Kolmogorov and his disciples. And Gasparov took an active part in that. His doctoral dissertation, PhD dissertation, Modern Russian Verse, which is pictured here, was published in 1974, and it was the huge analysis of the statistical values and characteristics of Russian verse of the 20th century. He also wrote a history of Russian verse in general and a monumental history of European versification, which is his only major work available in European languages, in Italian and in English. In English it was published by Oxford University Press. Gasparov also wrote, he also tackled other aspects of verse theory, such as the difficult and unusual combination of meter and meaning. And later in his life, he began working on a completely new branch of verse studies, which was the linguistics of verse. This is a book that he published together with his faithful disciple Tatiana Skulachova. Gasparov was a literary scholar interested in Russian literature in all its aspects. He was especially interested in obscure writers, and this is one of the volumes of poetry that he edited, 101 Women Poets of the Silver Age. He was one of the foremost scholars working on the works and literature of Osip Mandelstam. He was also a magnificent popularizer. This is a children's book, Amazing Greece, which was published in the 1990s and which is basically the single most important book that you have to read about ancient Greece if you want to read just one book. It's intended for children, but actually I'm sure the students of philosophy or philology, for that matter, could learn quite a few new things from it. He also wrote other books in the similar vein, such as the book about ancient Rome, early ancient Rome, and a book about mythology. These two were published posthumously, and they were not finished by Gasparov during his lifetime, and they were not as perfect as the book about Greece, but still they are important in their intent and in their material. Finally, in the year 2000, a collection of his memoirs, fragments from his notebooks, and various other, so this is a multi-genre book, Notes and Fragments. It was published to critical acclaim, and basically it's one of the best non-fiction books that were recently written in Russian. So I'll begin with the classics, which was the first and a very important source of Gasparov's inspiration as a translator. From the outset of his career, he was working on translation of Greek and Roman writers, and his first foray into that area were the fable. And the fables of Phaedrus and Baebers, in his translation with his in-depth commentary, were published in the prestigious series Literary Landmarks when Gasparov was just 27 years old. This is a rare photograph of Gasparov as a young man. Most people remember and know him as a kind of patriarch of Russian humanities. So this is that book. In Notes and Fragments, Gasparov wrote about one of his translation experiences, and this memoir vividly illustrates his unorthodox approach, and I quote here: "From the stylistic point of view, I encountered the worst difficulties translating the most primitive among my authors, Aesop. It's not a coincidence that every national literature has a treasure trove of classical remakes of Aesop, but no memorable translations. It's in the nature of the genre of the fable, which is indifferent to style. How should I write? The shepherd went to the forest and saw, or so the shepherd goes to the woods and sees. In Russian, these intonations are distinctly different, but which corresponds to the original intonation more accurately, I did not feel the nuances of Greek well enough to make a decision. So I devised a circumvention. I ordered in the library a large Spanish treatise on the vocabulary of Aesopian collections, and pencil in hand, I marked all of Aesop, Attic words in red, vulgarisms in blue, intermediary forms in other colors, and then in the fables that were mostly spotted red, I wrote the shepherd went to the forest, and those that were mostly blue, so the shepherd goes to the woods. For me, it was an interesting experience. I'm not sure if it was useful for the reader." So this is a mock-up. I don't know Greek well enough to distinguish between different forms, but this is more or less what it looked like. As a translator of classical ancient literature, Gasparov had to deal with a number of challenges, apart from Aesop's simplicity. For example, in the translation of Aristotle, he had to keep the esoteric style of the conspect, which is characteristic of Aristotle, but at the same time, he had to make the text intelligible. It was a very difficult task, because you can't actually do both things at a time. So what Gasparov did when translating Poetics, he kept Aristotle's text as it was, but he also inserted certain comments and filled the gaps in square brackets, like here. And so anyone who wanted to see what style Aristotle was choosing and what kind of conspect that was, he could read without the comments and the brackets. And anyone who just wanted to read a smooth text could read it with the comments. Another problem when translating ancient literature was with Diogenes Laertius, where the translator had to keep all the terms, the philosophical terms in Greek, the same for different philosophers, even though they could mean completely opposite things. In a volume published in the 1970s, The Historians of Greece, several historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon, were presented in Russian translations. So Xenophon was translated anew. For the other two, old translations had to be reworked. An early 19th century translation was taken for Herodotus, and a late 19th century translation was taken for Thucydides. The historical sequence thus emerged as if by itself, but old translations had to be substantially reworked. Translators of Thucydides, for example, were amazingly faithful to the meaning of the text, but they inflated it by 50%. So Gasparov virtually rewrote both Herodotus and Thucydides. I went to the library and I took an old book with a translation by Mishchenko of Herodotus and what was published as Mishchenko's translation edited by Gasparov. And here you can see, apart from proper names, everything that's where the words are the same, they are in red. Everything else is in black. And you can see the amount of rewriting of translation that Gasparov had to do. This is not even published under his name. Another tour de force was the translation of Ausonius Cento. Ausonius was a late Roman poet who was a teacher at the court of the Roman Emperor Valentinianus, and the emperor was planning to write a poem for a wedding at the imperial court in Trier, and he urged the official poet of his court, Ausonius, to do the same. And as Gasparov says, to write a poem better than the emperor was risky. To write worse was in all likelihood very difficult. So the old rhetorician invented an escape. For the wedding song, which was supposed to be indecent, bawdy, he wrote a cento composed of the lines taken from Virgil, which is Rome's most decent and most chaste poet. So you see here the various bits and pieces from Aeneid and from Georgics and from other works of Virgil, taken from its original context and inserted into a context of the wedding song describing defloration, which seems to be a recurring theme today. For that, Gasparov had to retranslate many of Virgil's verses, giving its context, because without that, you couldn't just take a translation by Chervinsky or Fett, because they were not suitable for this purpose. They were not accurate enough to be taken as such. The Marshak controversy was already mentioned today, and Samuel Yakovlevich Marshak was a very popular poet, universally loved to this day for his children's poems, and a gifted translator of poetry. He provided the only well-known and stylistically uniform translation of all Shakespeare's sonnets. In the late 1960s, Gasparov unofficially tutored his younger relative, a student of Moscow State University, Natalia Avtonomova, for her diploma paper on Marshak's translation from Shakespeare. And the result was an in-depth analysis of Shakespeare's verse and Marshak's translation of Marshak's strategies, which shows step by step and metaphor by metaphor how different the texts were, and the consistent toning down of Shakespeare's Baroque sensibilities and imagery to make the poems conforming much more to a neutral 19th century style. So this is an example of the original and the translation, and Gasparov goes on to show that in Sonnet 60, Shakespeare's impersonated time is raging. He confounds the gift he has given, transfixes the flourished net of youth, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. In Marshak's version, we see a calmer picture, and so on. So, in spite of being quite complimentary towards Marshak's skill, talent, and consistency, the article was seen as an affront to the established Soviet classic, and Gasparov was banned from editing the collected works of Marshak, and Avtonomov was prevented from pursuing further studies at the philology faculty and went on to become a student of philosophy. So even such an innocent pursuit as translation studies could acquire dangerous ideological undertones. Even more controversial was Gasparov's analysis of Valery Brusov's translation of Virgil's Aeneid. The translation, finished by Brusov's friend Sergei Solovyov and published in 1933, after Brusov's death, became a target for taunts and accusations of literalism, bukvalism, almost immediately after publication. Gasparov used this material to develop his ideas about translation and insist that literalism was not a curse word, but a scholarly notion. This approach was completely alien for the Soviet literature establishment, and Gasparov's article was republished in the prestigious almanac The Art of Translation under escort of 2, not 1, as was customary with ideologically suspect materials, critical retorts. Looking back at this episode in the 1990s, Gasparov wrote, "I wrote a separate article about the ill-famed Brusov's Aeneid. Among other things, it went like this. 5 periods succeeded each other in the history of Russian verse translation. The 18th century was the era of free translation, disposing to the Russian Moors both the content and the form of the originals. Romanticism was the era of exact translation, training the reader to accept new, formerly unfamiliar images and forms, such as Vasily Zhukovsky. Realism of the 19th century, again, became the era of free customizing translation, exemplified by Vasily Kurochkin's Béranger. Modernism of the 20th century returned to the agenda of exact translation, not impoverish the original in accordance with the reader's habits, but to enrich the reader's habits in accordance with the original. It's the agenda of not just Brusov, but of all his contemporaries, from Konstantin Balmont to Mikhail Lazinsky. Finally, the Soviet time is the backlash from literalism, demand for clarity, lightness, and traditional values of the Russian culture, the era of Marshak. Gasparov went on to superimpose this picture on the 5 periods of Russian culture from Peter the Great to the late 20th century, with broadening and deepening trends in regular succession. Civilization, he says, meets civilization just as one person meets another. To get their contact going, they have to see something similar in each other. To get it to continue, they have to see something dissimilar. During the first stages of acquaintance, translation selects for the reader such features of the French, Latin, or Chinese spiritual world which the reader possesses in his own character. And later, translation opens up the new acquaintance in all its complexity and allows the reader to adapt to unfamiliar, sometimes even unpleasant, features of his spiritual makeup, be it a different faith or different verse structure, if the reader is planning to maintain the contact, of course. Post-Soviet developments have confirmed Gasparov's reasoning, and with mass culture and highbrow culture increasingly separated, we now see more demand for more exact translation after Marshak's time, after the Soviet time of more domesticated translations, as was exemplified by the previous report. I'll probably skip the part about Ariosto. I'll just say that Gasparov's unique translation was the translation of Ludovico Ariosto's 16th century very long and very complicated poem, Orlando Furioso, which he translated in free verse. A very unusual thing for Russian poetical tradition, and a very unusual thing for Gasparov, who was always extremely attentive to verse form. In an interview to a Tartu student newspaper, he was saying, "I had no translation to translate Ariosto. I just wanted intention to translate Ariosto. I just wanted to read him." But reading as he did, pencil in hand, he step by step understood that it was easier actually to translate that than just to read it the way he wanted to. This is a fragment which was translated by Pushkin, and you can see here a very classical translation and a very unusual translation by Gasparov. Even more extreme were his experimental translations, where he, for example, translated one of Euripides' tragedies in the style of a Russian folk tale, and his conspect or shortened translations, where he usually took a long poem by a classic of the 19th or the early 20th century, such as the Belgian poet Emile Verhaeren, and compressed, let's say, 100 lines into just 20, taking out all the imagery and all the digressions which he considered superfluous for the sensibilities of the 20th century. Of course, it was purely experimental, and one of those experiments were the translation of Russian poetry into Russian in this condensed form. I'll give you one example. This is a note by Pushkin, «Любовь одна, веселье жизни хладная», and it goes on and on and on and on in the typical almost 18th century fashion. You have to excuse the author because he was very young at the moment. This is what Gasparov makes of it. Happiness in the roses of love, a song in the thorns of love. Be blessed, be immortal. I admire you, lovers and bards. I admire you from the twilight, from the grey rustle of woods and waves, from the cold dream of the soul. Too painful. The song is dead in a dead heart. A feeble gift flies away like a light smoke. This is, by the way, «Слабый дар отлетает, как легкий дым». It's almost an exact quote from the original. And love, let it be sung by the loving and the loved. It is our deep conviction that wider acquaintance of translation scholars and literary historians with the work of Mikhail Gasparov would benefit the humanities both in the West and in Russia, and it would help especially in the quest for fighting the fog, because I can't think of anyone who was better at fighting the fog than Mikhail Leonovich Gasparov. Thank you.